All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be covering the full stack lifecycle, uh, and more in depth. We'll be going into HTML and CSS today. We're going to be concentrating in the pure bare bones of what a front-end application does and what you can create with just pure HTML and CSS. We're going to be covering what is HTML. We're going to use Amazon.com as a visual example so that we can visualize what HTML templates can actually render. Then after that, we'll go over document structure, the content structure of HTML, some element tags, forms and input, HTML list, images, both from external sources and internal sources. Let me actually do this instead. Oh, hello. There you go. We're also going to be covering tables, how to create tables with HTML. We'll be going over some semantics. And then after that, we'll cover a little bit of JavaScript in HTML. We're not actually going to cover like manipulating the DOM. That shouldn't mean anything to anyone as of now. We're just going to cover the script tag and how the script tag can actually write JavaScript on your browser. Then after that, we'll be covering the CSS portion of our lecture. In CSS, we'll cover what is CSS, the different style tags, inline style, how to link a CSS sheet into your HTML. We'll be talking about selectors, the different types of selectors. We'll talk about the CSS Box Model, and then we'll talk about responsive web design. Not too much of responsive web design. We have an entire lecture dedicated to this, but we'll do a quick demonstration of some of the CSS elements that we have to create some responsiveness into our site. With that said, does anyone have any questions over what will be covered today? All right, if there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and kick off our lecture. Well, the first thing that I want to cover is going to be the full stack lifecycle. So I actually have this drawing here. We're going to keep it simple this week. We won't go too much in depth into all the other technologies that we'll be covering in this program. So let's talk about what happens when somebody such as myself or any one of you logs into something like Facebook or some sort of social media platform. Well, the application that's rendering on your app or the application that's rendering on your phone or your computer is actually going to be the same for everybody else, right? Everyone runs the same front-end program. When you run that front-end program in your specific machine that you're trying to view this information as, the browser sends a request, or whatever the application or the browser sends a request to some sort of server, and that server then responds with, this is what you are to render for the client, and it gives it HTML and CSS information along with a JavaScript script. Now that JavaScript script may also contact the browser for some extra information. So here we see our front-end application. I grab my phone and I log in. Well, after I log in, my JavaScript script goes and sends a request, which we'll talk about requests this week as well, over to a server. And it says, hey, this person wants to see all of the posts that are related to themselves or that belong to this feed. Well, the server accepts that request or redirects it or maybe rejects the request. But the server, which will be our backend, will actually take it, identify the endpoint of all underscore posts, and then conduct some sort of functionality to be able to generate our post. Now, by some sort of functionality, what I mean is it's actually going to communicate to the database. So communicate with some form of database, which is more than likely running on another server. And it'll tell that database, hey, I want to grab all of the posts that belong to this user. This right here will make more sense once we actually start writing some SQL this week. Once that database is done grabbing all of the information, it's going to return that SQL query over to the server. And then the server will then run some, maybe change the format in which that information comes in. Maybe there's some information that the front-end application doesn't need. So in order to make the transition lighter, it might get rid of some of that information. It might add some extra information. It might even run multiple queries to collect multiple sets of information and then mix them all before generating a response. Once the server is done collecting data from our database, it's going to put it inside of a JSON format, either JSON or XML or some YAML, but it's going to be in some format that's going to be easily transferable to the web. And in this program, we're going to concentrate on JSON. Well, once it has it in a JSON format, which is essentially just a JavaScript object, it's going to go ahead and send that information back to our front-end application. So here we see our object. It has the ID of post. It will have some posts, the person who made the post, how many likes it has, and then it'll have an array of objects, which will hold all of the comments and their information. And then from there, our front-end application will grab the response from the browser or from the server, I apologize, and run some logic to create actual components or visual components that we see on our screen, which is where our HTML comes in. All right, so that's the full stack lifecycle. You log in, a request goes over to the server then grabs information from the database. Once it has the information from the database that it needs, it conducts some uniformity to make sure that it formats it properly. And then after that, the server returns that information back to the front end, at which point the front end renders the information to the user. Does anyone have any questions regarding the full stack lifecycle? All right. Well, now that we know a little bit about how this works, and we can see a small example of how this transfer works, or this order of operations, that's what I'm gonna call it. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about our front end. So HTML, can anyone tell me what HTML stands for?
Hypertext markup language.
Perfect. So hypertext markup language. Now, what exactly does that mean, or why would it be called that? Well, when the browser was originally created, or the internet was originally created, everything that we saw on the browser was usually just quite literally text. It was just lines of text displaying information, and then eventually you would run into some sort of link that would take you into another page that displayed more information. And it was just links to different pages over and over again. The main reason why it was used back in the day was for universities to be able to keep track of records. As we know, things were run through terminal commands as well. But HTML has evolved a lot. And now HTML is to the point where we can actually create design. We can make things that are dynamic. We can animate objects inside of our browser. We can place videos and images inside of our HTML template. And a perfect example of what the modern browser or modern HTML is able to render nowadays is Amazon. All right, so if we take a look at Amazon here, we have all of these fancy things that are showing up. If I hover over something, we can see that the border of that element changes color, right? Changes over to white. Not only that, but on hover, we can see that a couple of menus are displaying. There's some dynamic web design for myself. We can see that my cursor turns from a pointer to something that's maybe typing some text. When I click on this box, not only does the border on the outside changes, but the actual colors inside of these buttons change as well, because this form is active. So as this form is active, it has some dynamic design so that it changes color, and this drop-down menu populates. Now, when I click back outside on the web page, the colors change again. When I hover over something, it changes. And more importantly, we can see here, we have a scrolling menu or some sort of divisions that are with some animation rolling to the left and right. And then we start seeing these cards, or at least I'll reference them as cards. Well, all of this looks super nice, and you know, you would think, well, there's some magic there's some different way that they were actually able to come up with this, and there's no way that this is just a simple design. But when you come to think about HTML, HTML is just boxes inside of boxes. So if we take a clear example of this, we can see our entire browser is rendering Amazon.com. Now inside of Amazon.com, we have a small header at the very top. So there's a box named header. All right. After that, we see that they have this, oh man, I forgot what it's called. Well, they have this element that's able to display different images upon clicking on them. We'll see this specific element later on once we start working with Bootstrap. And then here we can see that it starts displaying a couple of cards in rows. Well, before we start going into each individual card, oh, perfect. Thank you, Yams. It's a carousel. There it is. Thank you. All right, so before we start going over these specific cards, we got to think about how these cards are organized. Now, these cards, notice that as I start closing the web page, some things start leaving the screen, some things don't leave, so we know that they have minimum and maximum heights, and some things are told to hide once a specific size of the screen is achieved. Well, that tells me that each one of those rows has a division. Let's just do 2 for now. And then within the division, that's where those cards are being displayed. So now I can see one card that maybe holds an image inside of it. And other than that image, it holds some text. That's all it really is. Everything else that we see here, all the colors and schemas and everything, that's all CSS. But the actual structure of this site is just like this. And this is what HTML provides for us. It provides for us a bare bones structure of our site. Think about it like a skeleton, right? HTML provides us a skeleton, and CSS is kind of what fills in the rest of the body of our actual site, makes it look nice and pretty, or makes it look really ugly. But HTML will always provide for us the actual skeleton of what our site is supposed to represent. Does anyone have any questions over the concept of HTML and how it works on the web for creating our skeleton? Okay, if there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and start writing some code. So to start off with this lesson, before we actually start going into anything crazy, the one thing that I would like to cover is, well, what is HTML, or how does the browser know that what it's supposed to be rendering is HTML? Well, quickly, I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of our developer tools. If we right click on the screen and click on inspect at the very bottom, we'll see the developer tools open up. And if we scroll up on our developer tools, we can see there's quite a bit of things that we can look at. But when we scroll to the very top, we see this tag here saying Doctype HTML. It doesn't seem like it serves any functionality. And if I hover over it, it doesn't highlight anything on my screen. So what's the purpose of this tag? Well, this tag communicates directly with the browser. And what it does is it tells the browser, hey, here is a document. You have an incoming document, and the content within this document will be rendered in HTML format. So now, my next question is, well, why do I even have to specify an HTML tag, well, before the browser is the current state that it is now, there used to be different styles of HTML that you can tell the browser that it would receive. If you had something that was specific in frames, you could tell the browser, "Hey, this is an HTML that's happening to have frames and frames only." And there's a couple of other Doctype tags that used to exist back in the day. They still exist, and you could use them if you really want to. But as of now, the modern web just is able to render everything through Doctype. There's a shortcut in your VS Code. If you place an exclamation mark in VS Code, it's going to show you what the abbreviation is. So it tells you that this abbreviation will render Doctype, the HTML language, and we'll go over these tags here shortly. But I'm going to go ahead and place an exclamation mark and press tab here. All right, this is causing too much noise, so I'm going to go ahead and close these up. Okay, so this HTML tag or this Doctype tag is telling my browser, "Hey, browser, here's an incoming document, and it's coming in the HTML." Now this lang is equal to en. Well, that's just telling the HTML or the browser that the language in which this is coming in will be in English. And then just so everyone is, just a friendly reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, please ensure that you're placing them inside of the Whiskey Questions channel, just that we have a record of all of these, please. All right. So now the browser knows it's looking for an HTML tag. It finds HTML and it says, well, everything inside of this body, everything within this HTML tag into its closing tag needs to be rendered in one way or another through the browser. All right. So now it takes a look at head. Well, head doesn't really, it's not something that we can really see or mess with when it comes to the browser or the development of our front end application. But what it actually does is it gives details to the browser about how it's supposed to render our body. So here we tell it, we give it a couple of meta tags. This meta tag char set is actually telling it what kind of character set it should be utilized to, what kind of character set should be utilized to render these characters on the screen. In our case, it's utilizing char set 18. If we take a look at the head here, they're also using UTF-8. So we can see that there. That's the character set that we're utilizing, and that's what you'll see most of the time is UTF-8. I don't think I've ever seen something different. Then we have the meta, which is telling the meta tag, which is referencing the viewport. So that's telling my browser, hey, how should I, in what size or what size reference do you want me to use as a default for this screen? So we're telling it, hey, I want you to take the width, whatever width elements I'm referencing to or I'm specifying here. If I say 100%, then that should cover 100% of the device width. Or if I say 100 view width, then that should cover 100% of the device width. All right. And then after that, give it an initial scale. Well, the scale is kind of like a ratio. And what I'm telling the browser to do is to render things in a 1-to-1 ratio. So that covers our meta tags. And I see a couple of questions starting to populate. I'll be answering those questions here shortly. And then finally, we see this title tag. Well, we have a title tag in Amazon.com. So maybe I can find it. Let's see, where did you go? All right, so here's our title tag. Now this title says Amazon.com, spend less, smile more. And we can see that that's what's referenced here on the tab. They have an icon that you can also add as well. We'll be covering icons later on. But here, what we can do in our developer tools, which is actually pretty cool, is I can actually change the content of a site so that I can see what it would look like before actually changing it in my code. So now notice that I took the title tag and I changed it to Whiskey Platoon. Well, now in my tab, it says, it still gives me the Amazon icon and still knows who I'm referencing to, but now it also has Whiskey Platoon at the very top because I changed the content of title. So let's go ahead and give our title here. Let's make it Whiskey Platoon. Okay. So far, we've covered the Doctype tag, HTML tag, we covered head, meta tags, and title. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding any of these tags that we just covered? All right, I see a question on the Whiskey Questions chat. I see the developer tools is only in Chrome, right? Um, no, I believe every modern browser has a form of the developer tools. There may be different ways to open it, but I usually just double click or right click and then I click inspect, and that brings up a form of the developer tools. They may not look exactly like the ones they look on like the ones that look on Chrome. I strongly recommend to utilize Chrome for your development from now on rather than something else because as we learn in responsive web design, there's certain HTML or CSS tags that won't be rendered the same way in different browsers. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure who that was, but I hope that answered your question.
That was Albert. Yeah, sorry for not cross-posting.
No, no problem at all. All right. The next question is from Terrence, and it's the exclamation mark just created an HTML boilerplate, right? That's right. So by placing an exclamation mark in your VS Code, you should be able to press tab, and that should render the boilerplate for your HTML content.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. Now, before we continue moving on forward, the next thing that I want to talk about is going to be our live server extension. So if we go over to extensions, you should be able to find live server. So here's the live server. That's what it looks like. It's an extension that's going to be able to host your HTML template in your local machine. You can install it. It's probably the easiest way to get it to render because once you actually have this extension, well, at the very bottom, you'll see this go live. So I want to cover this a little bit in depth. Now, this go live is going to be referencing your terminal to find what it's supposed to be rendering. So if I'm currently in Whiskey and Nodes and I click go live, oh, it's not. I apologize. It is not using my terminal. It is using the selected file on my left side of the Explorer. So currently the selected thing that I had was full stack. And you can see how it is at the parent directory that I was making my selection. So that's what it rendered. I rendered full stack and it gave me all of these files that I can use. All right, I can still iterate my way into it. I can go into full stack, go into -1, and then after that, it'll render my index HTML. But that's not necessarily what I wanted to do. Instead, I want to make sure that I click on my index HTML before I actually go live. And it looks like that might have caused an issue here. Let me go ahead and kill my port. And now I can go live. All right. So now I have my server running. I'm currently running my server. It told me that I was running it on 6053. And if I take a look here, I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Gonna make a comment. I'm going to paste it. Well, let's see what it's rendering for me. Well, it's telling me, hey, we're going to access through HTTP. That's we'll break this part down here later on once we start talking about URLs and what their meanings are. But here is the address at where you can find this information or the address of this computer, right? Well, my computer or your machine, your local machine, will always be 127.0.0.1. Later on, once we actually start looking into deployment, you'll see how these numbers can change. And all these numbers are doing is they're telling the browser a specific address on the internet in which they can render, in which they can send requests to grab information and render content for the user. But for local development, since it's being ran inside of our machine, instead of looking in the internet, it looks at our machine in 127.0.0.1. But then after that, my live server said that it's going to occupy port 65036. So inside of my machine, this port exists, 65036. Later on, once we go into Postgres, you'll see other ports being occupied, like 5432, that will be running our Postgres machine. But in this case, this is the port that's being occupied by live server. So live server is hosting our index HTML inside of our local machine at the port 65036. And that's what I see here. So currently my browser goes into my local machine, checks port 65036, and then after that, it follows the path until it finds my index HTML. And once it finds index HTML, it starts rendering that on the screen. Now I know this is mine because I can see the tab at the very top says Whiskey Platoon. And that's what I have on there. I have Whiskey Platoon. All right. And that covers live server. Does anyone have any questions regarding live server? Okay, I see a question here on the chat. It says, what's the difference between us using the live server as opposed to opening the index HTML in the browser? It's a great question. So by opening the index HTML in the browser, I'm assuming you're referencing to manually utilizing your terminal to host index HTML on the browser. Is that what you're referencing to, Nathan?
Yeah, just like clicking and dragging that index.html and then just opening it in the browser, I guess, like manually.
Is that the
Yeah.
same, Nathan, as like if you go to file open in the browser?
Yeah, or just like click in the file and just it'll just open it automatically with the HTML file.
Yeah, so the main difference between that is that once you click and drag or you open the information on the browser with just your HTML, it's not going to have a feature called hot reload, meaning that every time I change something on my screen here and my document saves, we can see that there was a reload that was triggered, and now it only shows that update. If you were to open it utilizing the other method that you mentioned, Nathan, that wouldn't happen. You would have to manually refresh or manually reopen that document so that it can re-render on the browser.
Okay,
Does that
thank
answer
you.
your question, Nathan?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Of course. I see Natalie is typing. All right. Is there a reason why my live server doesn't open the HTML document? I always have to go to my ports and right click on the link. Are you currently on WSL, Natalie?
Yes.
Okay, so if it's something to do with WSL, more than likely your WSL doesn't have the permissions necessary to interact with your browser. We'll have to talk about that later on, and we'll take the WSL users and talk about how to tell your virtual machine how to find the browser that's existing inside of your actual machine.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions regarding live server? Okay, if there are no other questions, then let's continue moving on through HTML tags. All right, now this body tag. Well, what is a body tag? Why do I need this body tag? This goes a little bit into semantics, but essentially the body is telling my browser, hey, everything in here is actual content that you can put on the screen. So now if I start, now if I start typing and place something that says, hello, this is from the body, we can actually see, hello, this is from the body. And now, if I go back to my inspector and I click on my development tools, well, just like I said, everything is boxes. Look at that. Jeez. You can see how the browser is allowing this one line of text, even though it doesn't go all the way across, to occupy that entire top side of my browser. It's a whole box that's occupying that entire top side. All right. Boom. This gives me a little bit of power, but it seems like regardless of how much I write here, nothing is really changing. And notice that regardless of what's happening in my VS Code, how much indentation there is, I can press enter 3 times and break up these lines, but nothing changes here. Because my browser doesn't know that it's supposed to change. It's reading it at face value. It's saying, well, I know you have spaces between line 16 and 17, but I don't care about that. You're not telling me how to handle those spaces. So it's just rendering it as if there weren't any spaces. Well, that's where the rest of our HTML tags come in and gives us a little bit more of dynamic power when it comes to writing HTML code. So that covers our body tag, and it shows a little bit of what's going on. The next, we already covered title, we covered meta. So now let's go into headings. So there's a bit of, whenever you log into a site, there's usually one huge header that's displayed across the entire site. Well, now let's say that I wanted this to be whiskey Platoon. So there was my original text before. And you can see that, hello, this is from body, is a different font size. It's not bold. It doesn't have any of the information that whiskey PLT has. So just by placing in the H1 tag, we can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the two tags being displayed on the screen. Now, what are those differences? If I click on the selector arrow tool, I'm going to click on whiskey platoon. So this whiskey platoon, it tells me where in my body it's located. It's saying that my body holds an H1 tag saying whiskey platoon. But if we look at the right-hand side, it tells me that it comes with styles. And if we take a look here, it tells me that it's an H1 element, and every H1 element existing within an HTML document that is being rendered will have a display block, will have a font size, a margin block start, and we'll start talking about all these other ones later on once we go into dynamic design or CSS. But we can even see that it has the font weight being bold. Well, this is all the information that is rendered whenever I place an H1 tag next to it. Well, now what happens when I click on the text that I had before? Well, the text of hello, this is from body, it's not wrapped around any tags. And because it's not wrapped around any tags, it doesn't have anything as far as computed styles. So my tags bring in styling and sometimes even functionality. All right. Let's keep talking about tags. I have this H1 tag, but we already know from Markdown files that not everything should be an H1 tag, right? Sometimes we have subheaders, sometimes we have more embedded subheaders. So how does HTML handle that? Let's take a look here. Now I have an H1 tag. What happens if I change this to an H2 tag? Well, we can see that by changing it to an H2 tag, I'm still somewhat repeating the styles, right? If I take a look at this whiskey platoon, I take a look at the styles tab, it's still pretty close to what it was before. It still has a bold, it's still in margin block, it's still in display block, but the font size has changed. Now it's 1.5, whereas my original size was 2. This is utilizing EM as a unit of measurement. We'll go over that later on once we start talking about responsive design. But it's important to see how the size of our header tags will change depending on the number. So the higher the number, the smaller of our header tag. And the only tags that are available are from H1 through H6. Those are all the header tags that we have. So if I were to take a look halfway, let's make this into an H3. And then let's make this into an H6. All right, so there's all of our header tags. We can see we have Whiskey Platoon with an H1. We have Whiskey, let me zoom in a bit here. All right, we have Whiskey Platoon again. This is with an H3. And then we have an H6. An H6 being the smallest one, and it's not even utilizing one full EM. It's now all the way down to 0.67 EM. Does anyone have any questions regarding header tags? Notice that your header tags are also still using the entire line. They have this whole block. And I know we can see those orange blocks also to the top and bottom of them. And we'll go into that here later on once we start talking about the HTML box reference. Okay, great. So now we covered our header tags. We know a little bit about them. Now what's next? What do we have next? The next thing that we're going to be talking about is going to be our paragraph tags. So we have this original text from the beginning, and I kind of covered how regardless of how many lorem tags or how much text there's in there, it has no idea what to do with it, and it doesn't know how to reference it. Well, that's because text shouldn't just be placed into an HTML element or an HTML body without a wrapping tag, which in this case, what we have is a P tag. It's a paragraph tag. Well, it's to tell it that this is to resemble a paragraph. So now let's take a look at that. So paragraph tag, our text changed a little bit as far as its font. And we can see that it's now in display block. And it has a little bit of how it's supposed to start and how it's supposed to end, right? Now, if we do that quick demonstration again of what happens if we have a lot in our paragraph tag, what if there's a lot of information that I'm having in there? Well, again, it doesn't know how to break it up, right? I can place, let's say that I wanted to place a space here right after Arquitecto. And we can see that if we look for Arquitecto, nothing happens, right? There's no space here, nothing changed. It doesn't know how to handle that information. It's still looking at it at face value. Well, if I wanted to break something or I wanted to break a line of text, what I would use is a BR tag, which stands for break. So we can see the BR tag here. It says Arquitecto. As I bring it closer, it starts utilizing it and it adapts. If I wanted to have an actual indented space, I could always use another BR tag to be able to do that. And now because I have two of them, it knows that there's supposed to be two breaks. One of them with an empty line, and that's why we see one empty line. And the original break happening at the end of the first sentence, which is presentium. And we can see it at presentium. That's the general format of our paragraph tags and how to break them. There's a way to tab them in. We're not going to cover that today. We're not going to be covering every single HTML tag because there's a ridiculous amount of them. But know that more than likely, if there's anything that you want to do to your file, if there's anything you want to do to your text, there's likely an HTML tag that's already been made to do that behavior, rather than you writing it out through pure CSS. All right. So that's going to cover our body, paragraph tags, and header tags. Before moving on to the next portion of our lecture, does anyone have any questions over the material that we've covered so far? And to kick that off, we have here a question from Natalie saying you don't need an opening tag when using break. So that's a really good question, really good observation. We have this body tag at the very top, but we can see that at the very bottom, we have this closing tag. And we know that it's a closing tag because it has this slash at the beginning of it. Same thing with HTML. You see the same behavior with the H1. And again, we see the same exact behavior with paragraph tags. The only place where we don't see that behavior is in Doctype. But Doctype isn't an element tag, right? It's something that interacts with the browser to tell it what it's supposed to render. But once the browser is actually rendering information, well, it needs to know when that tag is over. Right? When is it moving on to the next tag? Or where is it finding another embedded tag? Well, if we have that behavior, what's going on here with break? Break doesn't have a slash at the beginning, so it's not a closing tag the way we see it. So rather it has a slash at the end of it, but it doesn't even have an opening tag. Well, this is called a self-closing tag. Self-closing tags have a slash at the end, and they do not need an opening and closing tag. They just need one instance of it to be able to exist. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yes.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions regarding the material we've covered so far? Okay, moving forward then. So we went over a little bit of content structure. Now let's go over element tags. We have the span tag, strong. Okay, great. So this is just going to go over how to divide some of the information that we currently have. So currently our body has this p tag, and then it has a header. Well, this p tag shouldn't just exist at the body level, right? Because then any changes that I make to the body will happen to this p tag. So sometimes I want to isolate some behavior. So for example, if we go back to our box method, to our skeleton that we saw earlier, my browser is rendering the page. After it renders the page, it is rendering some text. And after it renders some text, it renders an H1. Well, this text is, let's say this text is made the exact way that I want it to, right? I don't want it to change or be affected by anything at the parent level. The parent being the body, right? Well, then I would want to isolate that text and place it within its own box. Now, what I mean by that is I would want to put a parent division on top of it that would be holding my text. Ooh, my TL draw skills need some work. All right. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, what if at one point I decide that I don't want my my body to display information in this order? What if I wanted it to invert itself? Well, by doing that, if I invert it now, and I had a bunch of other elements on the screen, right? Let's say I had a couple of pictures as well. And not only do I invert it, but I also want it to display in a row now. Well, now when I go to display in a row, it's going to attempt to place everything at parent level inside one individual row. And if I don't have that parent division, it's going to squeeze my text all the way to the right-hand side and try to place all of my information in one row. That's not what I want. So in order to protect my text and make sure that my text stays in the size or with the whatever design that I have decided that I wanted to keep, I have to nest it within a division to protect it. And now what changes is everything around it, but the division is able to protect my paragraph and keep its design the way that I want it to stay. We'll see this more in action once we actually start going into CSS during the second part of our lecture. But for now, let's take a look at some divisions. Well, let's make this division tag. Gonna bring it down here, and I'm actually gonna take over my H1 tag to the very top of my body. Okay, see what we look like here. So now I have Whiskey Platoon, and I have this hello tag. It's exactly what we expected. There's not really much of a difference as to what I'm seeing visually, but let's take a look at the elements. So before I had this division tag, all I had was a body, an H1 tag, and a paragraph tag. But now I have a body, an H1 tag, and then I have this division, and inside of the division, I have my paragraph tag, along with all of my break tags. I was able to nest it. Regardless of how many divisions I have, I can go ahead and place another div. And keep nesting it. And we can see that I open up division. There's another nested div. And then there's a paragraph tag. And I could even divide it here. So let's make a paragraph tag. Say first division. So now we can see the first division at the parent level. All right, so here's the parent division that has first division. And we could even make it like this. So there we can see the first division start. And we can see the first division end, right? And inside of that division, there's a P tag saying first division start, a paragraph tag saying first division end. But then here we have a nested div. And inside of that nested div, we have our paragraph tag. Now notice that this division, its size changes along with its content right now. That's because I haven't told it exactly how to handle its size just yet. So right now, the division will always adapt to the content that's inside of it unless I specifically tell it to do otherwise through the parent or the division itself. But again, that will be more, and that will be a concept that we cover more once we go into that into responsive web design. I see a question here on the chat. Would this be wrong to think that of this as encapsulation because we're replacing things apart from each other so styles don't overtake it? It's a really good question. And I think that would be a pretty good way. Maybe encapsulation and abstraction, right? We're isolating behavior by placing it inside of division and making smaller classes, right? If we take a look at TL draw, think of each one of these boxes as a class that's being rendered on the screen, and think of the body as a huge overall program that's just running each individual class within it. Does that answer your question, Nika?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, the next tag that we have here is the span tag. Well, the span tag can be used to highlight any number of characters or letters that you would like, and it won't change it. It won't necessarily divide them. It won't change any of its styling. We can see here. Make sure this is running correctly. Okay, we have our span tag. And within our first paragraph tag, we have this tag named span. And then we see first division ends. But first, or the F of first, still is within a nested tag, right? Nothing changed. I'm just essentially breaking up one specific letter. Now, why would I want to do this? Well, if I wanted to just change, let's say we make a rainbow looking banner, right? So a banner where all the letters are next to each other. Well, what if I wanted to turn this into a rainbow? Well, by placing each one of those letters inside of a span tag, right? So rather than just having one word inside of a paragraph tag, I have individual letters inside of a span tag. Well, what I can do is I can rotate them. I can change the CSS of each one of them. Oh, this doesn't allow for me to rotate. Nice. Well, I can change the CSS for each one of them. It's this. To rotate the tags or rotate the letters and create this visual effect that it's actually arched when it's not. So again, we're just isolating characters or isolating one specific spot of our text or functions to be able to add functionality into our HTML tags. All right, the next thing that we'll cover here is strong. So strong will highlight our text and make it bold. So for example, here we have this hello. If I place in strong and add this text to a number of characters, it will make them bold. So we can see the hello tag is there. If I take it out and I do an entire sentence, we can see that it makes the entire sentence become bold. Along with that, we can also see the EM tag. Now the EM tag stands for emphasize. And when something is emphasized, it's actually turned into italics. So strong turns it bold, emphasize turns it into italics. There's the U tag. And the U tag will underline some text. And then there's the anchor tag, but we'll cover the anchor tag here shortly. All right, I see that I have a question. Go ahead, Kara.
Yeah, I was just curious, is there a difference between using the strong or emphasize tags versus using like the B or I just to bold specifically or italicize specifically?
V or I?
Like you could use B, like as in bold, to bold text, can't you? I thought that was something that you could do.
It looks like it is. Yeah, it's awesome. I actually didn't know about this B and I tags for bolding and italicizing. Let me go ahead and take a look. Maybe there is a difference. Or maybe they're both running the same functionality under the hood. So let me go ahead and find this division. Here's my paragraph tag. All right, so there's the B tag there. So the B tag just turns the font weight to bold. You can take a look at strong, and strong also just turns the font weight to bold. So it looks like there's no difference between the two. And I'm assuming it would be the same for I. It might just be that B or I is something new that came out, since strong and emphasize might be a little bit harder to remember than that. Does that answer your question, Kara?
Yeah, I was just reading about them earlier and I couldn't figure out what the difference was.
Awesome.
Seems
It
like it
looks
doesn't matter.
Yeah, it looks like DJ is saying that they are an older convention. And by older convention, I'm assuming he's referencing to strong and emphasize. All right, next we got Saul.
Yeah, I was actually reading up on that. I think there's no difference in what it does. I think it's meant as to show developers. I think strong is meant to show importance, and bold is just for bold.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so just to clarify, B or I are the old convention. Strong and EM are actually the newer conventions. And that is a great point that you bring up. So we'll go over that once we get into semantics and like the meaning of tags. But we're not quite there yet, but definitely agree. Okay. Now let's move on into anchor tags. Let's say that I wanted to make an anchor tag that takes me over to a site. Let's say I wanted to go over to Platoon. And let's actually get the Platoon site here. Oh no. There you go. All right, so there's Platoon. All right, we can get the actual site. Well, how do I tell my browser to go into Platoon? I have this text here. It's not wrapped by any HTML text just yet. But what I can utilize is something called an anchor tag. So that anchor tag is designed to actually send me to another URL. Well, currently, when I click on this text that says Platoon, nothing happens. It's not highlighted by anything. And if I take a look, it's still an anchor tag. It knows that it's an anchor tag, but it's not giving me any functionality. Well, that's because the anchor tag requires a hypertext link. All right, so here we can see if the element has an href attribute, then that represents a hyperlink, a hypertext anchor labeled by its contents. So we need to give it an attribute named href. And within that href, we need to place the actual site that we want to go to, which in this case, it will be Platoon. And now that we changed it, we can see that the color changes. It gives us Platoon there at the very bottom. And when I click it, it redirects me to the site for Platoon. There's a couple of other attributes that you can add into it. You could add something like target. And if you do blank, I think that's when it throws you into a different tab. So now it opened up the href in a different tab without closing itself. There's a lot of things you can do with anchor tags and all these other attributes that we're not going to be covering in today's lecture, but know that they exist. So make sure you're doing your research regarding the tags you're using. All right. That covers anchor tags. And the next thing that we have is going to be our forms and inputs. Actually, we've been going for exactly an hour. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions regarding the material that we covered so far? All right, since there are no questions, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and come back and pick up our lecture at 10 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and continue on with our lecture. The last thing that we just finished covering was an anchor tag, and now we're going to go ahead and move on into forms and input. All right. I'm actually going to go ahead and comment all of this information out just so that we don't have to deal with it anymore. And I'm going to move to the very bottom of my HTML document and start writing out a form. So I create a form, but my form doesn't actually do anything as of now. If I take a look at the form down here, my form just works kind of like a div, right? There's nothing on it. Doesn't show me any of existence, but it's if we're looking at more of like the hidden HTML or styling that happens behind it, notice it's not even occupying the entire block. It's just saying that it exists. There's supposed to be a form in there. Well, inside of a form, we can place things like input fields. Right? And by placing an input field, well, now my form actually has some space that it's occupying. I take a look at my form is occupying the entire left to right of my screen, regardless of how much it actually needs. Right now, it's just saying, all right, well, I'm going to occupy all of this space, and I know that I need an input field. Well, let's try to take a look at these input fields. The most generic one will be text. We'll see that a couple of times, but we can also collect other things like number. Well, that turns it into an integer. So here is our input field that I can click on and write some text. Here's my number field, where regardless of how much text I try to type into it, it's not going to accept it, but I can type in numbers. I can do something like color to be able to collect color input. Maybe there's a color that I want my user to be able to do. Maybe they're choosing their theme or their background. I could take that and have them submit it in a form so that I could change it for them every single time. What else is there? Cool. Let's see. We got checkbox. We got date. An email. And file and even image. But there's a couple of them, right? So this one just takes in my input, regardless of what I type into it, it's going to accept it. This here will only accept numbers. That's going to be my number input. We have my color, which takes in different colors. A checkbox, which will allow me to just check it or non-check it. There's also the radio. Right, which also is kind of like a checking function. It's just that it doesn't allow me to uncheck it. Another measuring form is going to be range. And range can allow me to grab the values between 1 to 100, right? Or whatever maximum and minimum I give it. If I click on this date functions, it's going to pop up a calendar for me to be able to select a date. Now here's my email, right? Now, when I do my email, the cool thing about this is that because I specified that it's an email, when I go to try to submit this form, it's not going to let me submit it unless it finds an @ with something afterwards. If it doesn't find this @ decorator, it's going to throw an error saying, hey, this is not a valid email. It's not going to actually validate the email, but it at least handles the fact that somebody has to put an @ in there. It's kind of useless unless you have an API integrated into this functionality that checks that email for you, but it's still good to have. And then there's this choose a file method where I can choose a file that I would want to upload so that I can actually get it into my program or inside of a database. So those are all the different types of input fields. But what's the purpose of this, right? Why do I need an input field? What does this input field do for me? Well, let's comment out most of these because we know we're not going to need them. And finally, let's make an input type submit. So when you utilize an input type submit inside of a form, that's telling the form that it can be inputted, right? I can give it this form a value or this checkbox a value of checked. I apologize. I think you have to give it a label, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this for now. Or is this checked? So I could check it. I could not check it. I can say that this is going to be the name. So give it a placeholder of name. Then it tells me, hey, this is supposed to take a name. This is checked. Okay, great. Well, why is that information necessary? Let's give this a name variable. That's going to take a name. Again, let's give it a name variable of true or false. And finally, those are the two inputs that I'm going to be taking in. Well, right now I'm going to refresh my page. Now I'm just going to click on the submit. Well, notice that when I click on the submit, it just gives me name up here in my URL, right? My URL changes. So here's my HTML. I click on submit and I get this question mark after my URL. Well, what this question mark is telling my browser or my program is it's saying, hey, there was a form that was submitted, and this is the information that was submitted to this form. So now if I say something like Francisco, and I go to submit, well, now I'm telling my program, hey, there was an information here submitted for the variable name, they submitted Francisco. Well, what happens if I put true as well? Well, now we can see that the name Francisco has been submitted. And true, because that's the name I gave it. I guess I should have gave it whether it's checked or not. But we can see that it was submitted with the value of on. Right now, if I submit this, it doesn't give me anything because there's no value to it. If I click it and I submit, it's going to tell me name doesn't have a value. And the next argument that came in was checked, and that was on. Right? So my form is able to capture data and send it to the browser. We'll go over forms a little bit more once we start actually talking about JavaScript and how JavaScript can interact with HTML. But right now, it's just important to understand that forms exist and that they can take in user input and send that information to different specific routes or give it to JavaScript so that it can do some functionality with it. All right. So that covers our forms. The next thing we're going to cover is going to be our list. So we have two types of lists in HTML. We have ordered list and we have unordered list. Each list, so I'm just going to say this is going to be list 1. This will be list 2. Both type of lists take in a subheader named list item. There's no limit to how many list items you have. The difference between the two being that ordered list can create numeric ordered lists, which is 1, 2, and 3. And unordered list just has bullet points that are circular. Right? That's the only difference between those two lists. All right. The next thing that we have are images. We're going to discuss internal images and external images. So let's go ahead and move forward here. And I apologize, I'm just trying to save some space here. Please don't pay too much attention to what I'm doing just yet. that's not it. Losing my mind. Here we go. Okay. Now that I have this information, I have my to list, I have my form up top. The next thing that I want to cover are images. So the image is just going to take an image tag. And it's going to be a self-closing tag as well. Now, we've already talked a little bit about images per se. So let me go ahead and inspect this Amazon.com. We can see that it's an anchor tag, but that anchor tag is wrapping a span tag. Interesting. Okay, not worth the squeeze. Let's go ahead and look up Amazon logo on Google. If I look up the Amazon logo on Google, I can inspect it. When I inspect it, we're going to see that they're going to give me this image tag here. And that image tag is going to have a source. When I hover over that source, it's going to give it to me as well. I can click on it, copy the URL, and place that inside of my own image tag. So now I can do src and tell it where it can find this image. So it's saying, okay, well, I know I'm supposed to render an image, but where am I supposed to grab this image from? So I give it a source so that it can find it and render it on my project. Now we can see that it's rendering this tag of a half Amazon, because that's the image that I chose. Well, that's for external. But what if I wanted something internal? What if I wanted it to display the CP logo? Well, I could do something like image and tell it that the source is within this directory inside of resources and that it's named CP logo. And just like that, it was able to grab the code Platoon logo, which was existing within my computer. So now we just covered external and internal images. Does anyone have any questions regarding images or ordered list or unordered list? All right. If there aren't any questions, we're going to move on to tables. So tables are pretty awesome. If I wanted to have something like a specific grid, I would have to manually do all the CSS for handling that information. But instead, I'm just going to create a table. Now this table can have a table head. It can have a table body. And it can also have a table footer. Now I have this table here, but currently, if I look inside of my tags over here, my table exists, but it has no content. Well, how do I make a table that has some headers? Well, I'm going to go ahead and create a table row, and this table row will have 3 table heads. I'm just going to do a little bit of a shortcut here to save some typing. So now I can see that I have table head. So I'm going to do header 1, header 2, and header 3. Well, what does that look like in my site now? Well, now my site has a table row with H1, H2, and H3. These are all headers, and they're all within my T head. All right. So here's my T head, which has a table row, and it has table headers. It doesn't necessarily show me anything fancy just yet. Well, what if I start working with the body? Here I close my table head. Now let's see what happens if I go into the body and I create 2 rows. So I'm going to go ahead and make 2 rows that are going to have table data of 3. Okay, well, again, it's not showing me anything on my browser. So let's go ahead and give it some content. So there's my content. Let me go ahead and inspect this so I can bring it up a little bit. Okay, so there's my row right now, my table that I just created. I can make another table row here if I really wanted to. But other than having 4, 5, 6, you can have 7, 8. Oh, hello. And 9. Right? Well, we just saw that. I could leave a space empty and it would just subtract it. But notice how it didn't contract the rest of my table. My table did that. It's actually able to work just like a table. It's able to understand that each one of these are separate divisions. They all have their own individual elements, and it's able to format my table for me. Now, let's say I had an extra row here or an extra table. Well, now it reaches out and it's able to let me know, hey, this one doesn't have a header and it doesn't have any parents above it, because I'm quite literally building the blocks from top to bottom. And that's going to be our table there being demonstrated. Oh, apologies. Maybe I want to demonstrate this table footer as well. Placing the footer above. I wonder why that is. I believe that it's supposed to have a TD. Let me double check. It is supposed to have a TD. Okay. So now we can see that it only has one. That's not working exactly how I wanted to. I'll have to figure out this table footer and the way it's supposed to work later on. I apologize, everyone. But you should be able to add a footer to your table. All right. Now let's go ahead and get into semantics. So semantics are, how are we formatting all of this information? That's great that we can get this information to show up, but let's bring back some of the code that we commented. So now I have all of this showing up. All right. Well, how do I know what's a header? How do I know what's part of the body? And how do I know what's actually being, what's important and what isn't important? Well, it goes into the way that I'm formatting my HTML. I don't just want to place information with H1 headers and expect other developers to know, hey, this is supposed to be the header of the site, because I could have H1 headers anywhere and then apply specific styling to them later on. So what you want to do is you want to utilize the tags of header to highlight what actually belongs in the header. So for example, what if this is my header? All right. Well, someone could have assumed that only the H1 tag was supposed to be part of my header, but they would have never known that this first div start is supposed to be a description of my header. So learning full stack. Right, nothing changed. The only thing that's changing is how I'm dividing my my HTML. So I can also create a content tag that's supposed to have all of my content. Right, so there's my content tag now created, and I'm able to divide that appropriately. So now my body has a header, it has some content, and maybe at the very bottom, these images are supposed to represent my footer. Just gonna go ahead and grab this table that I created here and bring it up. Okay, so we can see I have my list 1, my list 2, and then I have my table. And then finally, since I already have my content, oh, I placed my content in the wrong spot. I can make a footer. And that footer should only highlight the things that should be constant or consistent at the bottom. Now, these HTML tags, such as header, content, and footer, don't necessarily do anything. They don't have any built-in functionality to it. But what could be useful, or what could be the uses behind these tags? Can anyone think of any?
Is it for when like websites are called or like crawled, they look for certain meta information in these types of tags?
Okay, that's a good idea, right? Maybe I have something like a link to a CSS tag, and I could divide the styling by their header, content, and footer. Go ahead, Kara.
To like help improve readability for other devs.
Yeah, exactly. So the main reason behind these tags is to help improve readability for other developers, right? Notice my indentation when I'm writing all these HTML tags. I don't have to have them indented the way I do. I could place the indentation whatever way I want, and it would still read the HTML clearly. But it is standard that anything that's nested within a tag should be indented, right? Notice that this whiskey platoon is not being indented and that it's not being brought into a different line. That's just because such a short sentence, right? Somebody can see that and say, oh, well, that's the title. That's all supposed to be one there. Now, if I had an H1 element that was reading something like this, well, when I go to save it, and you'll see my auto formatter not only saved it, but now it brought it down. It said, okay, well, this is too much text. So this is something that we should nest so that when another developer looks at it, they can easily identify where the H1 starts and where it ends. All right. So now we have our whiskey platoon, we have all of our content, cover some of their semantics, and I apologize, I named it content. It's supposed to be named main. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, there's going to be other ones like aside, section, article. Currently, right now, we've been using a paragraph tag for everything. But let's say that one of these aren't supposed to be a paragraph, but rather a full article. Well, I would want them wrapped inside of an article tag. So maybe instead of this div, what I need is an article. This is an article that's holding multiple paragraphs of information. So here we see our paragraph tags. We have some line breaks in there to be able to separate our information. And then we have an input form, and maybe this is supposed to be showing some studies. All right, and our footer is just the footer of our company images. There you go. Okay. We haven't covered the nav tag, but we could see that here in Amazon.com. Let's go back over to Amazon. If I go over and inspect the specific button here, let me go ahead and open this up so that we can see it. Okay, so here we can see they're utilizing that header that we talked about. They're using a header. But rather than utilizing a nav tag, what they have is a division. And that division has an ID of navbar, which we'll see here shortly once we start talking about CSS classes and IDs. But this is supposed to be their nav, right? if I go to create a nav bar, instead of utilizing a division, what I should do is create a nav. So inside of my header, I would have a nav with a series of anchor tags, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make an anchor tag over to codeplatoon.org, which I think we already had from our link earlier. If I could find it. Here it is. And maybe this href is supposed to have a list of things like items and characters. Now, when I look over here, my nav bar, it knows that it's a nav bar, and rather than displaying all of these anchor tags from top to bottom, it's displaying them from left to right, because it knows that all of the links within it, or anything within it that's holding its own property, is supposed to be displaying from left to right as a natural nav bar. All right. That's going to cover all of our semantics. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding HTML semantics? Okay, if there aren't any questions, the last thing I would like to demonstrate is going to be the source tag, or the script tag, I apologize. So at the very bottom of our actual HTML template, typically inside of your footer or at the very end, you're going to want to use something called an SRC, or a script tag. Sorry. And this script tag may or may not have a source. We're not going to get into that just yet. But this script tag is quite literally referencing to any JavaScript functionality that you would like to display on the browser. So for example, if I go over to my console, we're getting an unexpected token somewhere, line 109. Okay, I don't know what that's in reference to, but we'll figure it out. But let's say the script tag has something like console.log, and we can see that my VS Code is already recognizing that it's supposed to be JavaScript. And I just wanted to say, hello, whiskey. Well, now when I go to refresh my browser, we can see that I have my elements to take a look at all my HTML elements, all of my design, or anything that I have to do with the actual skeleton. But now if I wanted to add some functionality or write something that JavaScript is supposed to be doing inside of my site, I can place it within script tags. And we can see that it displays it on the console tab of my developer tools, and it says, hello, whiskey. We're not going to go too much into how to call this function or how to write functions inside of JavaScript just yet. We'll see that later on. It's just important that today we understand that we have the capability to include JavaScript within our HTML templates. Does anyone have any questions regarding the script tag? All right. Since there are no questions regarding the script tag, we're going to go ahead and take a small break for a morning assignment, and then we'll continue on our lecture later on at 11 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and
All right, before we left for our break, we cover all of our HTML concepts. But now let's go ahead and take some time to look at the remaining of CSS. I'm going to go ahead and make a quick comment here. Missed that exclamation. There you go. All right, so everything has been commented out. Let's go ahead and take a look at some CSS today. We're going to be going over style tags, inline styling, and then we'll go over selectors for style tags. So let's kick this off by making a couple of paragraph tags. All right, so here's our 4 tags saying I am a paragraph. Now, although we have these paragraph tags, we can take a look at our selector tool here, hover over each one of them, and we can take a look at their computed styles. We can see that each one of them is in display block. They all have 1 EM for their margins, and they have 0 pixels about inline. Okay, great. We won't worry about the margins just yet. For now, let's just concentrate on colors and just making things look a little bit different than one another. So when you go to create your style tag should be included before the body. So I can go ahead and create a style tag here. And within my style tag, I'm going to specify first what element is it that I would like to apply a style to. Then after that, I want to open up a declaration block. So these curly brackets is what indicates a declaration block. And in my declaration block, I can do something like change the font size to, let's say, 200 pixels. Well, now we can see that my I am paragraph tag has grown considerably. Maybe I just want to make this something like 50 pixels instead. Now we can see I am paragraph has now grown. Now, the paragraph tag, the first one that comes in with display block and gives me all this information, right? Well, notice how my font size kind of gets added in here. So whatever you write into the style tag will always overwrite what comes in from my paragraph tags. So for example, currently right now I have a paragraph tag. But let's say I have an H1 tag that says this is an H1. So there's my H1 tag. My H1 tag comes in with display block and a specific font size already. Well, now when I give my H1 tag a font size of, let's say, 20 pixels, well, we can see that the font size changes, and we can see a little bit of change here in my computed styles. Let's take a look at what's going on. So this first section here at the very bottom tells me what's the first thing that gets loaded from the actual HTML. So HTML tells me that it's going to have a display block for an H1 tag. It's going to have some margins, a font weight, and some block, right? I could even change the font weight now if I wanted to. Let's say I wanted to say, well, font weight, and let's just make my font weight lighter. Well, now look at my H1 tag. My H1 tag has all of these aspects, but notice how font size now has a line through it. Well, it has a line through it because the browser is able to identify, well, yes, this is the default values that come with an H1 tag. But you told me to change those values from the H1 to where the font size is now 20 pixels and the font weight is now lighter. So now these 2 decorations down here no longer apply to my H1 tag because the ones that apply are the ones that I created right up here inside of my style tag. I could do other things to my style. I could change the background color. So I can say background color is, I don't know, let's say gray. So that we can see the background color. we can say that my border is, let's make it 5 pixels. And let's make it solid. And let's make it black so that we can see it. So now it's showing me my border. It's showing me my H1 tag. But notice how there's this outside part. It's still not currently showing. Well, let's try to make an example of that. Let's make a div. I would say this is going to be a card. Okay, so then we have a div of a card. Let's try to access that div and give it some decoration. So I want this div to have a height and width of 200 pixels. I want it to have a border that's going to be dashed gray. And I also want it to have some sort of background color. Can anybody walk me through creating that specific styling for this division here on line 19?
Yeah, Francisco, the first one, what was the first thing that you wanted to do?
Yeah, let's just set the height and width to 200. How could I do that?
Okay, so yeah, so height colon 200 px and then width 200 px.
All right. Okay, now someone else, please tell me, how do I add a dashed border that will be black?
I can take a shot at this. So you're gonna put border, and then I put 5 pixels, and then dash border or dash column, and then you just make it black from there.
Okay, awesome. So now I can see a dashed border that has my card. Okay, and now how do I put a light green background color to this division?
You can just put background color. And then you should be able to spell out light green.
Okay, so there's my light green background color. It's dashed, and I can see my border. Awesome. And there's my entire division. Now let's take a look at what's going on in our computed values over here. Gonna go ahead and click on my division. My division has my height, my width. It's still occupying display block because that's what it has inside of it. Now, display block is not in reference to the division itself, but rather to the contents of the division. So, let me go ahead and give you all an example here. Let's say P, hello. Oh, probably don't want to utilize P tags. I will take a look at an example of that here shortly. So, it's saying the display block is happening inside. But now let's take a look at what's actually happening with the card, right? I added all of these borders and stuff. I added this border, I apologize, and these colors. But what does a border actually represent? Well, the first thing that we see here is a margin. Then we see this border, and notice that when I hover over a border, it highlights my black dashed border. When I hover over padding, it shows me there isn't any padding. And when I hover over the size, it tells me that it's 200 px. Well, let's try to alter some of this information so that we can visualize the box a little better. Okay, so let's do some padding. And I'm just going to do padding all the way around. And let's do some margin all the way around as well. Or it's 5 pixels. Okay. So now let's take a look at this information. The first thing I have is my margin. Now, my margin isn't inside of my box, right? My box starts where this border is happening, but my margin is actually the space that it has between one box into the next one. So if I were to repeat this process, or if I were to make another div here, we can see that the space between these two is actually 5 pixels. They are 5 pixels apart from one another because of the margin argument that I'm passing into it. So there we can see the margin of the box. And I'm telling it anything next to it or nothing can be touching it until 5 pixels away from the border. Okay. Now the next part is going to go over my border. We know that my border is already 5 pixels. We can see that with a dashed. But what about this padding? Well, look at what that padding is highlighting. This padding is highlighting right underneath my border. All right, we see the border here, and now we see the padding. So the padding is the space between the content and your border. And then finally, we actually have our content. And our content being 200 pixels in height and 200 pixels in width. All right. Okay, so let's say I take off this margin. Well, if I take off this margin, I don't see anything that says that my div shouldn't be flushed to the wall of my body. But it's not touching the very wall of my body. Why is that happening? Why is it that this division isn't touching the corner of my actual HTML body? How could I find that?
You can go to the body element, look at its styling to see if the body element has some like padding around it or something.
Okay, yeah, so the parent of this division is the body. So if I take a look at the body, let's look at the very top. So that's where the body starts. Has some padding bottom. And this paragraph tag seems to be sticking out of my body. Why is that paragraph tag sticking out? Well, we'll take a look at that after. Let's start with the body here. So if I hover over body, what's that orange line on the outside representing?
Border.
Could you say that again, Will?
Does it represent a border?
Okay, so it could be representing a border. So let's select the body here. Well, it tells me that my border is non-existent if I look at the box model down here.
Oh, you got that margin.
Nice. So I got this margin here at the body level that's saying, hey, everything should be 8 pixels away from its corner. So now let's say I take that off. Let's go into the body. And let's say that I want my margin to be 0. Okay, well now I'm actually touching, right? All of my borders are actually touching each other. And I could see that my margin went away. Well, now here's a pretty good example of what could go wrong in CSS. So here we have my body. My body starts at the very beginning, right? That should be the very first thing in my element, but it's not flush to the top. Why could that be? And give me a second, Will. I'll get to your question here shortly. Why is it that my body isn't flush to the very top of my browser? We could be pushing it down.
Isn't there inherent styling that comes with each browser?
There is. Some browsers have some inherent styling, but that's not what gets in the way here. Tom?
Is it because the I am a paragraph like that element has its own built-in styling and stuff, so it's in like its own container and it's pushing everything else down.
All right. So now that's great, Tom. So now if we take a look at I am a paragraph, I am a paragraph has 50 pixels for margin top and margin bottom. So if we go over to the paragraph tag, how could I remove this margin top? Maybe I want to keep the margin bottom, but how could I remove this margin top?
Just say margin sub 0.
Nice. So I can say margin top is 0. And when I do that, it now flushes my body. It's still able to have the paragraph tag, and everything else falls in line the way it's supposed to. All right. Terrence, what's your question?
I don't have a question. Is my hand raised or something?
Oh, I saw a question. I saw a hand raised. I don't know if that was Terrence or if that was
Oh,
Will.
that's me.
That was Will. What's up, Will?
Yeah, can you also put like top, bottom, left, and right for the headers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this box method here that we can see, we don't have to specify the top. We don't have to specify. We don't always have to apply it all the way around. We can actually specify which one we want. So, for example, if we go back to our division here, we have this padding element. Well, this padding element is applied all the way around. If I were to want to visualize it a little bit more, maybe I could do something like 25 pixels. Okay, now we can see that the padding element is 25 pixels all the way around, right? And because the division is 25 pixels all the way around, it pushes my content inboard. Okay. Well, what if I only wanted that padding up top? Well, I could do something like padding top. And now everything changes to where the padding only demonstrates up top. I can also specify left to where the padding only happens on the left-hand side. And if I wanted to do something like left and right, well, I can do something like this. I can specify padding 0, which is starting top to bottom. So it's going to say, all right, well, the top and the bottom should be 0 pixels. And the second number will be applied to left and right, which is 25 pixels. I could also continue and give it different values for each one. So now we can see that my padding, if I go all the way out and specify everything, starting from the very top and working clockwise, my padding is 0 up top, has 25 pixels to the right-hand side, 10 pixels at the bottom, and 25 pixels on the left-hand side. All right, so I can work clockwise to actually specify what I want my padding to be. Does that answer your question, Will?
Yeah, it does.
Awesome. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding the style tag or the box model inside of HTML? I see a question from Steven on the chat. It says, would you use padding to center the header, or would that be something else? When it comes to centering, you don't want to use padding to manually center something. You actually want to utilize something like flex, which we'll cover here shortly in a couple of minutes. Okay, we'll give it a couple seconds. I think I see a couple people typing in the Whiskey questions chat, so I'm gonna wait. Okay, so I see a question from Natalie. It's saying, so padding is to add a space within your box and the margin is to add space within your web page. So let's take a look at this TL draw example over here. Here is my box or my element. margin will be the space between my element and any other element outside. So that right there is my margin, right? So that means that if I were to create another HTML element that wanted to touch it, it would only move as close as my margin allows it to. So there's my secondary element. It's not between my web page and one element, it's between elements and any other element coming to it. Now let's say that my content was somewhere along the lines of hello world. So there's my content. And if it's on display block, it would start at the very top, right? Well, padding is the space. Oh, don't want that. Between my element and the inside of the content. So the thicker this padding is, the more it's going to push my content inboard. It's kind of like filling it in. Does that answer your question, Natalie? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. All right, we got a question from Chen Yang. If you change the window size, will it affect padding? For example, if you're smaller your browser window, a picture which was too big will automatically shrink. But if you're padding this picture so it's border, will this picture keep the same size no matter what you change size of the window or browser? Okay, it's a great question. Let's take a look here. We can see that even though my window is growing or getting smaller, nothing is changing regarding this division. And that is because of the sizing element that I'm using. All right. It's still occupying 25 pixels. It's always going to, the content's always going to occupy 200 by 200. And my border is going to occupy 4.67. And the reasoning behind that is because I'm utilizing a unit of measurement such as px, which stands for pixels on screen, right? Remember that in HTML, we gave it a device content with an initial ratio of 1:1. That means for every 1 pixel on my screen, I am occupying 1 pixel in reference to size. So if I say 5 pixels, it occupies 5 pixels on my screen. And that's why, for example, down here, we can see this border get thicker because that's 5 and 5, which is 10 pixels. If I were to use a different unit of measurement that was responsive to the height and width of the parent or the viewport, then it would change. But we're not at the point where we're talking about responsive web design just yet. Does that answer your question, Chen Yang?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now we've talked a little bit about applying CSS. We talked a little bit about the box model. But now let's go ahead and talk about the different ways that we can add styles into our elements. So we've talked about selectors, and one way that we've added a style into our elements is by directly referencing their tags. We're saying every paragraph element should have this information, and every H1 element should have the following, along with our div. Well, there's something called inline styling. We have two divs that are identical to each other. They both have the cards, they both share the same padding. But what if I wanted this div to have something different. I wanted this div specifically to have something along the lines where the padding is the same all the way around. Well, now notice that the first card changed, but the second one didn't. Well, that's because this inline style is applying to only this division. So then the next question is, well, why would it choose to apply this instead of choosing to apply what's coming in before the body? Well, HTML kind of works as like Python and JavaScript as far as its line of execution, right? It's working from top to bottom. So it reads all this information and decides that this is the styling that it comes forth. But when it gets down here, it says, wait a minute, there's a new style tag. So now instead of applying what I applied up here in my division for this specific div in line 33, it's going to apply the newest or the latest element change that it's tracking. And that's why it applies the 50 pixels rather than applying the 0, 25, 10, and 25. Nothing changed for the second division because this style tag is only pertaining to this first div and not the second. And that's inline styling. Does anyone have any questions regarding inline styling? It all still works the same. I can still add other things. For example, I can change the font size here to be something like larger. All right, I can change the font weight. To be something like 500. And that should bold it. I guess it's not. It should be bold. Okay. So all that this style that's working inline works exactly like this style tag. I can still format it the same exact way. It's just happening within the same division rather than happening before the body is rendering. Any questions regarding this information so far? Okay. If there are no questions, let's go over how to connect an outside style sheet. So far we made this style tag and we're able to write all of this HTML and all of the CSS. The problem is that everything is kind of put together. I don't want all my entire program isolated into one file. It's not good practice, right? If I have a syntax error somewhere, I need to be able to identify where the problem is coming from. And the more separated that I have my functionality or my program, the easier it will be for me to identify where the problem is coming from. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to name it main.css. CSS for cascading style sheets. Okay. I'm going to take all of my style. I'm going to place it inside of this style sheet. And then I'm going to remove my style tags. Okay, and I'm even going to remove my inline style that I have here. I don't want it there anymore. Okay, and then for now, I'm going to go ahead and comment it out and paste it. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Let's go ahead and bring that inline style back so that we can grab it. Okay, and we'll use that here later, here in a couple of seconds. So now all my CSS is gone. And like I just said, I want to isolate where my CSS is being written. So I placed it inside of a different file. But how do I tell my HTML to utilize this file for style? Here within the head tag, I can bring in all of the styling that I wanted to load before it starts rendering my body. Just like we had the style tag prior to the body tag, we can bring in my style sheet prior to the body tag within the head. So I'm telling the browser, before you start rendering anything within my body, make sure that you are able to process and understand all of this styling within this styling sheet. And what I'm going to use for that is going to be a link tag, where I'm going to specify that the relationship is a style sheet. And I'm going to provide it an href to main.css. And now we can see that as soon as I told it, hey, you're going to find this in main.css, my program said, all right, well, the relationship to this link is that this is a style sheet. This relationship part is purely for us to be able to understand this, all right? The browser needs it so that it knows, oh, okay, well, this is a style sheet. It's not just some random file or some random link. I'm supposed to use this so that it can bring CSS into the program. And then this href is just telling my browser where to find this style sheet. And once it finds it, it reads the CSS and applies the styling to all of the selectors that we have in here. And it goes to the p tag, h1 tag, division tag. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions about how to link a CSS style sheet into index HTML? Okay, if there are no questions, let's go ahead and move a little bit forward. Well, we talked about applying this style sheet to one inline style, right? I want it to only apply to one division. But even though I want it to only apply to one division, I don't want to put any of my styling within index HTML. It doesn't make any sense to have my styling in two places. I should have that behavior isolated. So I want this first card to have that one instance, but everything should only apply to this first card. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give this card an ID. I'm going to say this is going to be my first card. And my first card now can have the following style. So rather than having all of this padding in here, the way I have it listed, I can say ID first underscore card, indent everything. And now we can see that my first card, which has that ID, now has a padding of 50 pixels, a font size of larger, and a font weight of bold. And it's only applying to that very first card because I gave it that ID of first card. Now, it's very important to remember that IDs are for one specific element. You do not want to utilize the same ID for multiple elements. We'll see the importance behind that later on. Specific frameworks won't allow you to do it, even if you wanted to, but HTML will allow it. Now, even though it allows it, it is not good practice, and you don't want to do it because when you're utilizing JavaScript, you'll need this ID to be unique so that you can grab specific elements. But we'll go over that later on. Remember, IDs are for one specific element. No two elements should have the same ID. Now, with that said, these are both cards, and they have the same division element. Well, what if I wanted to create a third division? But this division isn't supposed to hold anything other than text. Well, this division isn't supposed to hold anything other than text, but it's still, oof. Let me go ahead and make this into a span tag. I apologize, everyone. I have all of that text made from before. Okay, so now I have this third card here, and it has all the styling that applies to division. But I don't want that styling to apply to division. I only wanted that styling for my cards. Well, how could I take it away and make sure that multiple elements that are cards have the same styling? Well, that's where classes come in. So I can give this a class of card and give this other division a class of card. Now, both these divisions, they're supposed to be cards. And I can go over to main.css and change this div to dot card. So that's going to grab the card element and apply all of the CSS. But now when it goes over to my last div, well, now my last div doesn't carry that same information. It's working like a regular div because it's not carrying the same styling as the class of dot card. All right. Does anyone have any questions about how to add a class, which is for multiple elements, how to utilize IDs, or how to grab a selector by the HTML tag? Yeah, I see some people writing here in the Whiskey Questions channel, so I'm gonna give it a couple of seconds here. All right, so I can see the question from Landon. Could you just import .card as in card card? So as in creating its own HTML component, you can't. Later on, we're gonna talk about React Bootstrap, which will create HTML components that will bring it in for us so that we can just import it and export it with styling. But as of pure HTML and CSS, you can't do that because that feature is not made yet. Does that answer your question, Landon?
It does. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. So now that I have this information, let's talk about a little bit of the hierarchy order here. Well, I have this card, and then I have my first card, right? These are both applying to divisions. I'm gonna go ahead and move this body part up here since we don't need it right now. Now let's grab the div, and let's just say that I want the border to be red, solid, and I want it to be 10 pixels. Well, here's our border all the way under. It's solid and it has 10 pixels. So that's just a regular division. Well, now we can see that after the division, it goes into the card, which changes this border being from red to being black and dashed instead of solid and red. And it also changes the size of my border. Now we mentioned earlier, everything is red in CSS from top to bottom. So it would be safe to assume that if I put div at the very bottom, that this would turn back into being red, but it doesn't. It doesn't turn into being red. Why is that? Well, the reason why it doesn't turn into red is because it prioritizes. There's a hierarchy order here. So if we take a look at our README, here we talk about our selectors, and this is important to add here. So I'm going to add it real quick. The order is always going to work where IDs, styling for IDs will always trump everything else. Then it will go into classes. That will trump everything afterwards. And then finally, it will go into HTML tags. So that's how the selectors work. Any styling applied to an ID will trump any styling applied to a class. And any styling from ID or a class will trump a tag. Okay. Well, what if I brought back inline styling? What would happen if I say style and I say that I want my border color to be red? Okay, well, now let's see. Well, that changed. right? And that's trumping both my ID and my class. So that also tells me that inline style trumps my ID, my classes, and my tags from main CSS. Does anyone have any questions regarding the hierarchy order of these selectors? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. The last thing that we're going to be covering today, it's going to be responsive web design. So let's go into that part of our lecture here. Going to comment out that styling. And I'm actually going to comment out all of this information here as well. And now I'm just going to make multiple divs. Okay, awesome. I think that should be good. An odd number. All right, and let's actually grab all of those divs by their style class. And let's give them all a height of 50 pixels, a width of 50 pixels, and a border of 1 pixel, black and solid. And I'm going to add one more division in there that is going to have the ID of container. Okay. Well, what does this look like? We talked about nesting divisions within one another. Currently, what I have here is one, my body. Oh, hello. My body doesn't have a header. Instead, it just has a division named container. And within my container, I have 9 separate divisions. Okay, currently I'm only going to be able to fit 6. Maybe I can make this smaller to be able to fit a couple more. All right, so there's what's happening. Right now, my container has a default display of display block. And I can take a look at it in here. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. So let's hover over my container. So here's my div container, and it has display block. Okay. Well, what happens if I go into my container and I change its display to display flex? Well, notice that that turned all of my elements going from left to right to top to bottom. Now let's see what's going on here. Let's take a look at the browser. I'm gonna use the selector tool. Here's my container. All right, I'm hovering over my container right now. There you go, there's my container. And it's currently going from left to right. And there's my body. And my body, we can see that it ends pretty short before it even goes into my HTML concept. But here's my container. My container is still occupying the entire space from left to right. But now if we take a look at the cards themselves, the cards are only occupying the space necessary to exist. They're not stacking themselves from top to bottom. They're just simply going from left to right and not occupying any more space than what they need. Okay. Let's go back to my container here on my developer tool. So here we can see my CSS style from container. Let's take off the display flags. Well, what's the difference? There's my container. But now my card is occupying the entire space of my container all the way to the right-hand side of it. All right, so what's really happening is even though my container is only this big, it's in display block, or my container is in display block. So every card or every element occupies an entire block of space, meaning from the very left to the very right, all the way for each individual element. So that's what display block means. When if I bring back my display flex in my container, instead of every single one of them occupying an entire block, it's saying, well, now all of you are going to exist only using the amount of space that you need to exist. And so on. Well, there's a couple of other things that I can do to my container. What if I wanted my container to only have a width of, I don't know if each one of them are 50, let's say 255 pixels. Well, look at that. It took away each card's width of 50 pixels, and it said, no, we can't do that. Because if I do that, then I can't keep you within my flex, right? I'm telling my container, hey, I want you to withhold all of the items that are nested inside of you and keep them regardless of what their CSS styling is. And you can see how each one of them are being indented. It's saying, hey, I know you wanted it to be 50 pixels, but because of the current size that we're in, I have to squeeze it. Okay, well, let's comment this out and let's see what happens as I squeeze this box. Well, earlier somebody asked, well, what happens once we start squeezing it? Let me go ahead and make a copy here. Well, now we can see that the same concept is applied. All right, if I start squeezing my screen, all of the boxes become smaller to fit the content that I told it to fit. Okay, great. Well, what if I wanted a different behavior? What if I wanted them to wrap around? Well, instead of manually having to type that out, I can do something like flex wrap and give it wrap. And now instead of manually typing, hey, this isn't working, I want you to change it in a specific way, it's saying, well, now that the box doesn't fit, I'm just going to throw it into the next column. And that's the power of Flex. There's a lot more elements that come into Flex. We'll go over Flexbox Froggy later on, and we'll cover Flex a lot more in detail once we start working with our responsive web design. But this should give us a general idea of what we can do here. Now, another example is we can add actions to specific cards. So I can say that on hover, the background color should be blue. Well, now every time I hover over a card, we can see that each one of those card background colors change into blue. And as I hover out, they change back into white. A different action that I could have is I could have it be active. So I can say that a card, when it's active, should have the background color being. So now we click here. Okay, well, as I hover, they're still blue, but when I click on a card, it turns gold. And it gives my user a little bit of responsive web design. They're seeing their effects happening on my card, and I'm able to adapt depending on what my screen size is or the height and width of my actual container. Does anyone have any questions regarding this small demonstration of responsive web design that we covered today? Okay, if there aren't any questions, then today we went over HTML. We went over the full stack lifecycle. What is HTML? We looked at a visual example of a website and broke it down into its skeleton. We went over the document structure, content structure, element tags, forms and input, HTML list, images with external and internal sources, how to create a table in HTML, semantics, JavaScript and HTML. We covered CSS, style tags, their hierarchy order, how to use the link tag to use an outside sheet. We went over the CSS box model and the responsive web design. Does anyone have any questions over any of the subjects that were covered today? All right, if there aren't any questions, then I am more than confident in your guys' ability to start working and creating some dynamic HTML skeletons that will deliver some pleasant CSS outlooks to deliver your projects. You guys have already created a couple of projects with some terminal commands. Start thinking about how you can take those programs and turn them into actual applications, right? How could we take all of those OOP programs that we wrote and turn that into and create a user interface rather than a terminal program to have users send in input and create classes? All right, at this point, that's going to conclude our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop.